Concept of supersensuous reality. It is actually a subject of philosophy, the understanding of reality in the universe. For long, this has been the domain of the philosophers, but now the scientists are also entering into it. From the ancient times, when people didn't just have it much of the instruments of what we use today, the people naturally relied on their intuitions even more than we now rely in the recent times, and the people had more leisure times also. Thus, they exercise some different faculty of the mind to access knowledge and to understand the universe. And the paradox is that with the much less number of equipments and communication resources at the time, people were able to exercise instead their intuition and thinking and other mental faculties much more than we used to apply in the modern times. The difference now is that we are more reliant on statistical surveys, statistical analysis, test of hypothesis, and many other methods, and finally reaching a conclusion based on probability, and that is what carries the modern science. So, the empirical science or official science of today is based on statistical analysis of collected data through many modern means like application of technology, application of communications to get more and more data. So the modern world has become rather data based, but the ancient times were representing an era in which people with minimum of data somehow still managed to access some conclusions of knowledge. So now we see how the methods of knowledge developed throughout the history of mankind. In India, in the ancient times, there were certain sects or communities called Jains. They had their own religion called Jainism, and they had many scholars, and they developed some systems of inquiry into the knowledge world, and they categorized the means of knowledge as at least 5, and some school of thought in the same Jain community claimed that it is even 6. So, what are the basic 5 means of knowledge as envisioned by the Jains? The Jain scholars stated that the highest form of knowledge, the means of knowledge, is through omniscience, that is direct perception of the whole world, the knowledge world, through mental capacities and not using the so-called sense organs like the typical 5 sense organs in each of us, the human beings. And the second means of knowledge was what we now call telepathy, that is also accessing the knowledge world using mental power. But telepathy is a relatively narrow domain of accessing knowledge, just discovering the mind of another person, but not the whole world or the whole knowledge world, including every beings, every places, every times, every era. That grandest knowledge is coming through omniscience. That was the first method discussed. And the second method discussed is telepathy, and the third method being discussed is clairvoyance. This is the third method that the Jains suggested, and it was also claimed by the Jains as a very direct method. It also avoided the typical use of sense organs, and the clairvoyance was also reflecting mental power without using the typical sense organs. But clairvoyance is a concept not necessarily accessing the mind of another person, but some happenings or objects in a distant place or time visualized just like the sense organ eye visualizing it. And the fourth means of knowledge that is labeled in the Jainism as that the Jains label as Sruto knowledge. That means in English it is called scriptural knowledge. That amounts to actually documentation by other people, lectures by other people who themselves observed something in the first place and forwarded their experience as a knowledge to others. So this means of knowledge, the fourth means, which is called Sruto knowledge, that is scriptural knowledge, is not using one's own mental power, but it is using another person's lecture or writings. At that ancient era, it was often lectures, so it was called Sruto, which literally means something that is heard. So originally it was literally meant to be lectures, but nowadays it is meaning both lectures and written documents of knowledge. So Sruto knowledge or the scriptural knowledge is either in lectures or in written forms and delivered by someone else. Now the fifth source of knowledge which to be discussed is the one that Jains called Moti knowledge. That means what the modern people call empirical knowledge. This empirical knowledge is exactly what the Jains labeled as Moti knowledge. Moti means knowledge coming from direct not knowledge coming from observations by the typical sense organs, essentially. And whether it is direct or indirect has been looked upon from different angles by the modernists and the ancients. The ancients labeled this as indirect knowledge, but the modern people call the empirical knowledge as direct knowledge, because it is coming directly from the sense organs. It is most easily perceivable, most easily visualized, most easily observable. So it is direct knowledge, and since the sense organs are easier instruments to work, so things are considered direct these days. But actually in the ancient times, this kind of knowledge, Moti knowledge or empirical knowledge, was considered indirect, because the sense organs worked as a middleman, thus bypassing the original capacity of the intuition or the inner mind. Thus the mental capacities of the person that is very deep was avoided. The deepest mental capacity of the person was bypassed. The person rather used the typical sense organs as an agent or middleman or a third party, and since the knowledge is obtained through this third party, which are these typical sense organs, so the Moti knowledge or empirical knowledge is considered indirect knowledge in the Jain philosophy of ancient India. So in ancient India, there were thus two kinds of indirect knowledge. One is Moti knowledge, that is empirical knowledge, and the other is Sruto knowledge, that is scriptural knowledge. Scriptural knowledge also was considered indirect, because not only was it coming from from another person, but that another person also depended on their own typical sense organs rather than their own intuition. So that another person, or even if that another person depended on their own intuition and concluded through their own mental powers, since this is not experientially observed by the original person, so it was still considered indirect knowledge, even if it was a conclusion by the other person as a direct perception, like telepathy or clairvoyance or omniscience on their own part. But since the first person hasn't experienced it as direct knowledge using their own mental capacities and relied upon that other person, so it is indirect. Thus Moti and Sruto, empirical and scriptural, These two types of knowledge are called indirect ones in the ancient paradigm, and the other three, the clairvoyance, the telepathy, and the omniscience, which are labeled as in Indian ancient language respectively as Obdhigan, Monopurjagan, and Kebalgan. Clairvoyance meant Obdhigan, telepathy meant Monopurjagan, and omniscience meant Kebalgan. These three knowledge were considered direct knowledge by the ancient India. Now, in the modern world, things have reversed totally in the internet except the websites promoting Indian philosophy. Any website that doesn't promote Indian philosophy considers empirical knowledge and scriptural knowledge as very close to people, and every other kinds of knowledge as some kind of foggy knowledge. In other words, in modern times, empirical knowledge is and scriptural knowledge, documenting the empirical knowledge like PDF research papers, they are all considered very direct things. And anyone practicing telepathy or clairvoyance or meditative, intuitive, direct understanding of the grandest world, their conclusions are considered indirect. Exactly the opposite terminology. So, terminology varies depending upon the times, the era, and also depending upon the places in the world, that is cultural difference or based on geographical differences. In the Western world, empirical knowledge is now considered the only source of knowledge or best source of knowledge, if not only source. But in our ancient tradition in this country of India, we always know that empiricism is indirect and it's a partial knowledge, and the greatest form of the greatest means of accessing knowledge is the use of inner mind power, which bypasses the observations of the typical five sense organs. So ancient India has taught us that the actual best means of knowledge are the informations collected by the capacity of by the deepest capacity of our inner mind, like intuition, etc. The conclusions that come from clairvoyance, the conclusions coming from telepathy, and the conclusions reached by deep meditation, they are the best means of knowledge and the most direct means of knowledge.